Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this professional pensions webinar on engaging members with their pensions. My name is Hope Williams-Smith, and I am the Deputy Editor here at EP. Research from Wealth at Work shows us that most trustees hold significant concerns around member engagement and understanding. So today I'm joined by Director Jonathan Watsley to take a closer look at the findings. And we're delighted also to have Capital Cranfield Professional Trustee Jonathan Reynolds joining us to shed some light on how best to help members understand their choices at retirement. Now, please do remember that you can ask a question at any time during the webinar by typing it into the question box at the bottom of your screen. So to start us off, Jonathan W., could you set the background for us, please, on your research, on the findings, and particularly on the areas of trustee concern that you've seen?
Yeah, good afternoon all. Thank you, Hope. So we've carried out research amongst the trustee group, but also the member group as well, just to try and take a temperature check as to where people's thinking are and how prepared they think they are in terms of their retirement planning. A lot of figures came out, but I'll give you just a few highlights just to get the discussion going. If I just look at the member side first of all, probably the two key figures that came out were the concern around being able to afford retirement. So roughly a third of the respondents said that they were very concerned as to whether their savings would be sufficient for when they got to retirement. And having said that, 41% actually recognised that they were not saving enough, and that's a bit of a theme that we've seen is growing, which comes back a lot to affordability, and of course with the economic backdrop we've got at the moment, with the cost of living crisis, with energy prices going up, etc. I think it is reasonable to say we're probably in an environment where people are not going to have spare cash to increase contributions in the main. So different ways are going to have to be looked at as to how that issue can be addressed. If we look at from the trustee perspective, some of the numbers, in fact a lot of the numbers that came back from the trustees, I was actually quite shocked by, because the percentages were very, very high. So again, just to give you a flavour of those, 70% of trustees said that they were concerned about the level of engagement by members into their pensions. 89% said that they were very concerned that they didn't think that members understood things such as the tax implications of different choices when they took their pension. And one of the highest figures, 94%, was concerned that individuals could be potentially scammed out of their pension at the point of retirement or in the lead up to retirement. And we know that's an issue within the industry. We know from figures such as the PSIG figures, something like 40,000 people have been scammed out of either all or part of their pension monies since 2015. So we know that is a reality. So we seem to be in a situation where, whether you look at the member research or you look at the trustee research, there seems to be considerable concerns by significant numbers of people in both areas. So I guess the question is what should trustees and indeed employers be doing about this?
Most definitely. Jonathan R., as a trustee, bearing those points in mind that we've just heard there, do you worry about a lack of engagement with members, particularly at that point of retirement?
Okay, thanks very much, Hope. So just to start with, I've been a professional trustee for 9 years. I have a portfolio of 11 schemes. 10 of those have a DB element, and quite a few are hybrid as well. So we've got some DB and some DC, and I'm also on a master trust board. But I just want to start with a positive comment, is that what I've seen, over the years with regard to the hybrid schemes, those people who've got some DB elements of their pension, a lot of pensioners make some very good, sound decisions at retirement. You know, where they've got a mix of DB and DC, a lot of them are using their DC pot in very appropriate ways. Funding their PCLS from it is an obvious example. But even those where they've got residual amounts left in their DC pot, there's lots of sensible decisions when they're drawing taxable lump sums from it, spreading it over tax years. Now, so there is good news out there. There is good practice, but I think that is generally, with those employers that are really working hard with trustees to get the communication across to members. So holding things like retirement workshops for people and helping them make the decisions. So there's lots of good stuff that as trustees we should still be doing in terms of helping our members make those decisions. And I think for those people who've got some state pensions, some DB and a bit of DC, actually those decisions, are relatively simple. But the reality going forward is that we're going to get more and more people who've only got DC, state pension, a bit of DC, and that's going to be much more of a challenge. Now, the first point that caught my attention there that you said, Jonathan, was about the lack of affordability, the lack of contribution, lack of saving. This is a difficult one for trustees. It's not our job to design pension schemes. It's for us to run the scheme as it's designed. But clearly, employer contributions are key. There's no magic in DB pension schemes. One of the reasons DB pension schemes have been so successful is because they're funded well. And so you've got to get employer contributions up, get a good contribution system where members are encouraged to pay more in matching contributions, that sort of thing, I think is imperative. So they're behind the scenes. This isn't necessarily a comms issue up front, is working with the employers to make sure that we get good contribution structures in place, because that, quite frankly, is the only way members are going to be able to afford a good retirement outcome. Most people cannot, off their own bat, pay 20% member contribution in. It's just a fact. So that's one thing I think that we can be doing, is discussing that with employers and trying to facilitate ways of getting the contributions up. The other thing that I think is really important to understand is that when people get to that point where we're largely dealing with DC pots, so this is a real issue for the whole pensions industry, because when a member reaches retirement, first up, it isn't as simple as it used to be. First question is, when do I retire? When you're in a DB scheme, there's a definitive retirement age and everyone focuses on it. But when you're in a DC scheme, and in the current world of work, with perhaps people not thinking there's a Friday in the future when I stop working and I become a pensioner, I think more people are going to be phasing their retirement. So these questions about when do I start to do that? How much work do I do? How much do I draw from my pension are really key. So that engagement's got to start really early with members so that they can build up to this point and start thinking about when they can reasonably start to retire. Because ultimately, when you reach that point, you've got three really important things that you don't know. First up, you don't know how long you're going to live. Secondly, you don't know how much money you're going to need because you don't know what things are going to cost. I haven't got a clue what things are going to cost in 10 years. And finally, I don't know what investment returns are going to be. And a really important thing that people often overlook is, of those investment returns, I don't know how they're going to pan out. I don't know if it's going to be good for a few years, then bad for a few years, or how that's going to work out. And all these things are really important. So the whole process of engaging with members must start really early, because we've got a long process to retirement. We've got the at-retirement decisions that need to be made. And then if we're going to have members who are drawing pensions, maybe 3, even 4 decades from our fund, we've got ongoing issues that need to be covered off all the time. So this is a real challenge for the industry. And it's great that we're here talking about it today. And I realise I've spoken an awful lot and perhaps need to shut up for a bit.
No, thank you so much. They are some really, really crucial points. And Jonathan W., what extent does this engagement really have to happen at key points in the members' working life, early and mid-career, as well as sort of that crunch period, pre-retirement, and then the actual point of retirement.
Yeah, so I think Jonathan's right in the sense that we do need to make sure that members are engaged throughout their careers, and clearly throughout their careers they're likely to be in different jobs and therefore different pension schemes as well. I think one of the key things is identifying what the key messages are at different life stages. So if you look at people perhaps in their younger years, although it doesn't necessarily have to be in their younger years, but probably more likely to be the case, where actually there is a lot of other calls on their income. So, for example, the saving for a deposit on their first flat, or getting married, or whatever else it might be. Clearly, a lot of young people also now have student loans, so they effectively have that 9% tax that other people wouldn't have if they didn't have that student loan. So there's a lot of pressure on that income, and then when you overlay some of the things that have happened recently, as I mentioned, some of the cost of living issues, then you can see that it's an environment where it's very, very difficult to get people to contribute more. So one of the questions becomes much broader. Even though it relates to pensions, and that might be the objective of it, actually it's far more about how people manage their finances generally. So in order for somebody, for example, to take up an additional match that Jonathan matched, then how are they going to, as an individual, free up that money themselves in order to get that match from their employer? So there's a lot of work that increasingly is being done into how people manage their budgets, where they spend money. And this isn't the old school thing of oh, you know, don't buy a coffee on your way into work, and if you save up all those £2.50, then over a lifetime, you know, that will help your pension, because it tends to be too immaterial, and people tend not to react to things that are related to things they want to do or they like to do. It's the same as saying to people, you know, don't go to the pub on a Friday night, and if you did that for the rest of your life, you'd save X amount and that could go into your pension. Trying to impact lifestyle in issues like that is very, very difficult. But where you can impact them is where people can save money on things actually they have no emotional attachment to. So this is getting people to understand things like where they buy their car insurance, where they buy their household insurances. We've identified that a lot of younger people have multiple subscriptions to various download services, and often those download services, either some of them are not used, or effectively they duplicate each other. So why do you need you know, two or three when one would do? So it's getting people to think about how they can free up money in what I would call where there's very, very little emotional attachment, and if they are able to, and of course for some people that still won't give them enough given the broader environment, but if they are able to, then that's, having had that discussion and got people to understand that, then that's an opportunity then for them to perhaps divert some of that money they're now saving into the pension, and therefore get the match, etc. Of course, there's other points in or life stages as well that this needs to be considered. So another cool one is we call it mid-career. It's basically notionally the people that have been in work for, let's call it 20 years, but have got another 20 years to go. So they will probably have pension savings of some description, but it's really important not only to understand, well, does that mean they're on track for the sort of retirement that they want at the age they want to retire? And if they're not, then clearly they have a good chunk of time to try and rectify that situation. But it's also to look at well, where are all these pensions that they've had historically? So we know there's an issue brewing with small pots, which is, if you like, one of the downsides of auto enrolment. So people having lots and lots of small pots across various providers. But also, on a more broader sense, we also know that there are pensions often languishing in the wrong funds which people should be taking a look at. And actually, at that mid-career point, that's not a bad. Well, they should be looking at them annually, really. But if they don't get to it to mid-career, then that's a good point to look at it to try and rectify the situation. And then, of course, as you get older, then it's really important to start then thinking about what the retirement options are. If you've primarily got DC, which increasingly people will have, then actually how can you draw that money? What are your options? And so again, even though people can't draw their money until their mid-50s, it's probably quite important to start talking about that by the age of 50, so that people start getting used to the idea of what the options are. It gives them time to really think about it and consider it, and maybe even change their minds before they get to the point where they draw income. And I think that's really important, because of course we do know that some of the poor decisions that people make, so for example where they pay a load more tax than they need to, or worse, they get scammed, that's often because they've actually given very, very little thought, and they've reacted very, very quickly when an offer has appeared on the table. And it needs to be, after a lifetime of saving, it needs to be a much more considered approach.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for those points in terms of how we balance the different ways to go about engagement. Like you say, Jonathan, I think one thing that would be really good to discuss is how different styles of engagement suit people in different phases of life, particularly when it comes to the balance between regulated financial advice, perhaps which is not as affordable in certain age groups, versus free guidance. Obviously, then there's financial education that comes in at every phase of life. There's this, the concept of midlife MOTs. So I guess my question is, how is the best way to go about it at those different key stages?
Is that for me, Hope?
Yes, yeah, it could be for
either.
Okay,
okay. So yeah, it's a very good question. So speaking from my own experience on a master trust, I have a very simple mantra that that we want to try and get across to members, and that is get in, pay in, and stay in. And by stay in, it means stay in the scheme and stay invested. And those are some of the simple things that people can do in order to to improve their outcome. And Jonathan's always mentioned the idea of consolidation. I think that's great, and that's gaining some traction. There are some commercial consolidators are out there all over the tube that you can see that are really doing quite a good job at communicating with members and saying, this is something you ought to be doing, bring your pot together. So we should be piggybacking on that, as trustees, and saying, yeah, and we can do that for you, and we can do it simply. So I think that's really important. Simple messages, and give people simple things that they can do to help improve their outcomes. One of the things I really like, but again, you have to work with your employer on this, I really like the Save More Tomorrow approach. So you can get people to say, sign up today, and there'll be a gradual ratcheting up of their contributions over the next few years. I think that works very well, especially if you tie it in with people's pay rises. It's a way of trying to oil the wheels, really, to make this a bit simpler. I know it's not easy. You can't magic up money from places to just say, let's get the contribution rates up. But there are these relatively simple things that we can do as trustees to try and help members make good decisions and improve their outcome. But on that broader point, Hope, on different things at different stages, this is really interesting. So on the Master Trust I'm on, we did a survey of our members to find out how they wanted us to communicate with them. And quite frankly, he just came back and said, well, quite a lot of us like email, quite a lot of us like paper. Some of us like to trawl the internet. Others, would like a webinar. Others would like a sit-down seminar, a lunch, learn and lunch at work. Unfortunately, it doesn't come out simple. This is the way to do it. And so I think from a trustee perspective, what you have to do is try and work at what works for your scheme. And of course, you don't always have that utopian position where your members are all still working there. A lot of them will be deferred. So some of the options aren't as easy as others. But the key thing is trying to find out what works for your members, and to sort of target them in an appropriate way. And I think you're going to have a mix of media that you use in different ways, getting in touch with people and explaining to them, what they should be doing to improve their outcomes.
Most definitely. And just building on that, Jonathan R., there's a great question here from one of our viewers who is asking for any comments on balancing a genuine concern for members and the requirement for trustees to not be overstepping the mark when it comes to that guidance advice boundary.
Oh, that's a very, very good question, because it's one of my pet hates, to be honest with you, is that catch-all phrase, seek independent advice. And I really don't like it when people hide behind that and say, oh, we're getting close to the line. We're stepping over the line. I think we need to be bold as trustees. We need to do what we can to help members. And rather than sort of stepping back from that line and saying, oh, we want to be absolutely sure we don't cross into advice, we should be pushing that and saying, right, this is what we think is the right thing to be doing. And we should be bold in putting forward that. Of course, you can have the caveats and say, this is not personalized advice, but it shouldn't stop us from saying to people simple things like, if you're taking taxable lump sums, it's a good idea to spread them over different tax years so you don't push yourself into 40% tax. We shouldn't be fighting shy of that and saying, oh, that's close to advice. To be honest with you, it's a simple fact that we should be sharing. And I think there's lots of facts that trustees can share with members that will help them make better decisions, that we should be boldly putting out there rather than saying, oh, I'm a bit worried that I might be encroaching on the advice area. But that's a personal opinion, and I can understand other people will have others, but I like to do what I can to try and help members without hopefully stepping over that line and somebody saying, you advise me too, when clearly that was never the intention.
One thing that is really important in all of this is, of course, the current climate and context that we are in. And Jonathan W., I'll just put a question to you here that we've had that says, is it appropriate for schemes to be discussing additional payments when for many individuals, budget and money management tips are not going to help with the cost of living crisis that they are facing?
Yeah, so I think there is a balance to be struck here, isn't there? Because I mean, some people will be struggling so much right now that the whole notion of trying to do anything to increase pension contributions would just seem ridiculous to them. So I think there is a balance to be struck, which is why these interventions really need to be a journey. And the messaging, not only to the various groups as we discussed earlier in terms of various life stages, not only will the messages change for that, but the messages will also change depending on the broader economic environment. So there's things that we may not feel comfortable saying today. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to say. It just means that we don't believe that it's the right thing to say because of the broader context. And this will go back to things like profile and membership as well. Clearly, if you have a scheme where the profile of the membership is a lot of low-paid workers, then you're going to think twice about that. If the profile of your scheme is such that you've got a lot of much higher paid workers, then you might be a bit more relaxed about it. So the whole segmentation and targeting and thinking about the messages are really, really important. The days are long gone when we used to produce a pension brochure for 10,000 members, and it didn't matter whether the member was on minimum wage or the chief exec earning a million. The message was always the same. Those days are long gone. We need to segment far more than that. I was also going to pick up the point that Jonathan was making about the advice piece as well, because I think one of the things that schemes should be very clear about is it is perfectly fine for them to talk generically about things that could be done. So with Jonathan's example there of the taxation, then that is something that people could do. And there is nothing wrong with trustees explaining that is a possibility. Where trustees shouldn't go is telling them what they should do as opposed to what they could do. Because as soon as you say to someone, yes, you as an individual, you should only be taking part of your tax-free cash, or you should be taking it all, or whatever, that's when you're getting into advice. But explaining generically what could be done, there is no problem with that. And I think that's one of, because that line, people seem to struggle with that line quite a lot. I think that's one of the reasons why actually more trustees now are appointed regulated advisors, because then they can not only do the due diligence on them and all the rest of it, but they can then, if they feel they're getting close to that line, they can say to the member, well, look, an option you do have is to call the regulated advisory firm that we've appointed.
I think one of the key barriers that several of our listeners have identified in some of the questions is the barrage of new products that are always coming into the industry. So, Jonathan R., do you think that there is a need for perhaps fewer and simpler products where engagement is concerned?
Thanks, Hope. I'll get back to that. Make sure I do. Just wanted to make a comment on something that Jonathan W. just said about, that arose from the question. It was a really interesting question about, what about the members? Is it appropriate to be talking about increasing the contributions at this moment? I just thought really important thing that trustees should be doing at this time is, look, recognise that some people will be in financial distress. They might opt out of your scheme. So one thing, talk to your administrators, see if that's happening, because if that is happening, you're then going to have to think, is there something we can do? Should we be communicating with members? Say, we understand, because, okay, if some people are going to opt out, they have that right to do it. But what we need to do is try and make sure that even when they're able to opt back in, that we get them back in. It may be that we're able to prevent them from opting out. Again, it's their right to do it, but really important to stay on top of. If you see those patterns of behaviour, that should be the trigger for action. And the other thing is things like when you get bad news on investments, do you see members taking action? Is there suddenly an uptick in people who are switching to cash, for example? It did happen after 2020 when there was when the first lockdown happened and we saw markets fall. You need to be on top of this and say, is there unusual activity? And if there is, what should we be doing? What messages should we be communicating to members? So there's some really practical things that trustees can do at these difficult times. Just keep an eye on what's actually happening on your scheme. Now, back to your question on simple products. Look, I think the reality is the industry needs to innovate. It really does need to innovate, and it needs to innovate in terms of the products that we've got. We're already seeing it with, collective DC schemes. That's an innovation that may be useful going forward for certain people. But there's lots of room for innovation in the market, particularly in that retirement space, and retirement income funds, and enabling people to manage their drawdown over many years. So we need innovation, and we need innovation in products, and we also need innovation in services. We need innovation in robo-advice and in providing advice that is affordable. Because I hear exactly what Jonathan W. says about pointing people to appointed advisors, and clearly that makes a lot of sense. I think the problem is the expense puts a lot of people off. So we do need innovation. We do need new things coming to the market, but clearly we can't overcomplicate. And so this is the really important thing about communication, is that we need to understand what it is that we really think people should be doing in terms, to improve their outcomes, and what simple messages we can put to them that will help them achieve those good outcomes. So I'm all for innovation, and I want the industry to keep developing things, keep coming to market with new propositions. As trustees, I'm keen to make sure that those can be channeled into something useful for our members that they understand and that they can use to improve their retirement prospects.
I think just looking a bit more specifically at that point about simple messaging there, Jonathan W., we've got a question here that says, are there resources that explain pensions in simple layman's language that would really encourage members to engage when you consider that the vast majority think that pensions is so complex and so confusing?
Yes, it's a good question. I think the industry is moving towards now. I suppose two other professions in a way. One is the marketing and communications profession. So this is the whole piece around how do you engage with people? What are the triggers? What are the hooks? And clearly that, depending on where you are in your life stage, or maybe indeed what type of pension you're in, that could be that could be different. And the other industry which there's a lot of learning from is the L&D and training industry, because there's a real acceptance now of different learning styles. So even though you could say, well, like, here's two people, they're both 25, they both earn the same thing, they're both in the same pension scheme, so therefore aren't they the same person? But actually, one has a very different learning style to the other. So a combination of, if you like, that marketing expertise, that segmentation expertise, overlaid with learning and development expertise, is where some of the more exciting stuff, the more successful stuff, is appearing now. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is what are the hooks and the triggers that will engage those various groups, and then once you've got them engaged, what are you telling them? What are these messages? What are these simplified messages that you're telling them? And through work that we've done, we realised that for some people, they want to talk to somebody, because that's their preferred learning style. That's a preferred option. Other people would much prefer to do it digitally, so they might look much more at videos, or they might look at animation. They might be much happier to use digital tools. Even things like digital quizzes, for example, where people go through and get a score, and you get a gong at the end of it. So there's a lot of innovation there. And I think when you overlay that with the point at which people need to make decisions, that becomes quite an interesting dynamic as well, because people may learn something, but actually they don't really make any decisions out of that. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means they actually just know more about their pension than they did before. But then for at certain times, there will be a decision that comes off the back of that. So some of the tools, for example, that we get members engaged with will be video followed with maybe a calculator as to, well, could you afford to take an additional match? And if they decide they can, then that triggers that additional contribution with the employer. Clearly, if it was someone at retirement, that may trigger somebody saying, "Oh, blimey, I really now want to talk to someone." So we've seen a massive increase in the use of, some people call them personal financial coaches, some people call them helplines, call them whatever you want. But the point is, somebody wants to the member wants to have a conversation with the individual, and that's not regulated advice. So that will only be answering, if you like, generic questions. But actually, it's a way to engage, and then for that individual to decide what they're going to do next. And for some people, so again, take the retirement group. For some people, that will be, okay, I've now got enough information. It was delivered in a way that I understood it, and I'm now happy to go and make a decision. And I believe that's an informed decision. Other people will go, you know what? This is quite complex stuff. I realise now it's quite complex. I kind of understand some of the issues, but I don't really feel that comfortable about making a decision. So actually, I will go and get regulated advice, as an example.
Jonathan does your experience sort of echo some of those points that Jonathan W's made?
Yeah, most certainly. I think the whole issue of different people wanting to learn different ways, and it really came to light on one of my trustee boards, in that we were discussing just our own preferences, and one of my fellow trustees, similar demographic to me, we expressed polar opposite views on the use of videos. I'm not keen on tapping on videos on news sites. I prefer to read it. He absolutely loves videos. That's how he would prefer to get his news. So we have to recognize that people want different things. And I think, good schemes are doing this. A lot of people are using video statements, still sending out the paper statements, of course, little animations that help people, who like that sort of thing to get a handle on their pension scheme. And this is really, really important, because one of the other aspects that came out of a survey that we did was that if you ask a relatively simple question like, do you know how much is in your pension fund? It basically comes out a third of people who have got a good idea, a rough idea, no idea. So clearly we've got different people with completely different attitudes, and it's important to try and find a way that we can talk to them and say, here's what you've got. Here are the things that you can do to improve your prospects and help members exhibit the sort of behaviours that are going to get them a good retirement outcome.
Now we've got quite a spicy question here that I think both of you will want to speak on. One of our listeners has said, isn't it the trustee's job to make sure that money is well invested and the scheme is well administered? Why then does the trustee have to have any responsibility to get the employer to increase contributions or to guide a member in how to use his or her money? Jonathan R., did you want to start?
Yeah, okay, so first things first, like I said, it's not the trustee's job to design a pension scheme. So it's not our job to say what the employer contribution should be. That's their bag. But it doesn't mean that we can't have that conversation with the employer and say, if we've got a scheme that's just got the sort of minimum staging payments for auto enrolment, is it too much to go to the employer and say, you do realise that this is providing the bare minimum. It's not likely to meet the PSLA living standards. Those are conversations that's perfectly reasonable for us to have with them, but we're not obliged to. But I think it's good practice to say, this is how this is how it's going to pan out. Somebody could work for you for 40 years, and the outcome's not going to be great. I'm used as a trustee to having those awkward conversations with employers. If they turn around and say, sorry, that's the way it is, that's all we can afford, so be it. But I do think it's worth having that conversation. In terms of the investment side, yes, absolutely, we are responsible for the investment choices, and I think setting the default proposition is of huge importance. In a master trust, you'll find well over 95% of people are in the default proposition. That gets a heck of a lot of attention. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. There's huge numbers of metrics. We are all over the default fund and how it's performing. Clearly, we've got other people who are doing self-select as well, and we have very strict governance conditions all over that. But what we can do, hopefully, through a good, well-designed default fund, is provide appropriate investment for DC investments throughout their investment, and that's pretty much as we can do. We can't control how much they invest, the contributions that go in. We do have an important role to play in the default fund. When it comes to that absolutely crucial thing is, well, what do I do with this? How do I turn this into an income? What we're trying to do is help. What we're trying to do is communicate in ways that get people to engage with their pension, understand what these options are. And if we can make that as simple and as possible, I think it's going to help people make good decisions.
Jonathan W., what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so if I pick up the second part of the question, in terms of it's not the trustee's responsibility to guide member to how to use his or her money. Yeah, I think that's true. It's not to guide the individual how to use their money, but I think there is a responsibility on the trustees, and I think the regulators, both the pension regulator and the FCA, are pushing very, very hard in that direction. And the reason they're pushing hard in that direction is because this notion of somebody could be saving into their DC pension for 40 years, save very diligently. The trustee does do a good job in terms of making sure that those monies are invested appropriately and the cost structures are appropriate and it's well administered and all the rest of it. And then that individual, after 40 years of not only that individual doing the right things, but the trustee doing the right things, because they get abandoned at the point of retirement and arguably in that run up to retirement, they actually make bad decisions. And we've got so much evidence of people making bad decisions. Now, though, some of those bad decisions are not fatal decisions because it's just that actually HMRC just gets more tax out of them than otherwise could have been the case. So clearly that reduces their income, but it's not fatal. But at worst, as I've said, people could be scammed, and we all know the stories. So the issue here is that the people need to understand what options are available to them, and it must be a key purpose and role, and I would argue even fiduciary duty of the trustee to make sure that members have an understanding of those options, because otherwise all of that good work for 40 years could essentially be undone in a nanosecond. Now, if you look at the FCA, they've already started to deal with this, and I'm sure many people would argue that this isn't a perfect solution, and I would probably agree with them. But they have put in since last year investment pathways, which is this whole notion of trying to get people to understand what options they have and forcing the providers to think about actually what would their investment solution be for the four outcomes that they described. Now, that hasn't happened with the pension regulator yet, but I suspect that day will come. And again, you look at some of the master trusts, and even though they don't have to do it, they're doing it already. So I think there is a responsibility on the trustees, and I think that responsibility will pressure will grow.
Jonathan, can I just add a little anecdote on the master trust issue? So on the master trust I'm on, we absolutely want members to stay with us. We want them. It's a to and through retirement solution. We want people to stay for 3 or 4 decades. And the governance of our scheme is set up to do that. And this is a real challenge that has to be met by the industry, because this is something new. The flexibilities haven't been with us that long, and we're not yet at a position where we've got people in their late 80s still drawing a pension from a fund. Those days are ahead of us, but the governance challenge is enormous for them. The reality is, I think, if people live long enough and they're using drawdown from pension fund to fund their retirement, they will eventually become a vulnerable customer. And the reality is that trustees may be dealing with people who are extremely vulnerable, and may even have people who have the power of attorney. So there's huge issues that need to be covered off over the coming years. The challenges are legion, but the master trust route is we want that money to stay. We want to manage it. We want to have solutions that will give people a good retirement outcome, and that will give them the confidence that this thing will see them through to the end of their days. And there's lots of really innovative ideas out there that are coming. I think it's a bit of a watch this space for how that will pan out. And believe it or not, I'll use the A word, but I think annuities may well play a part still in long-term provision for people. And so lots to happen, and lots of decisions that people need to make at retirement and during their retirement to how they're actually going to secure their income for the rest of their days.
Talking of securing that income, one thing we've yet to touch on is costs. And we have an interesting question here from a listener who has identified themselves as an employer, and they have asked, whose money are you spending when you are guiding savers? Is it member money? Is it employer money? And they've said this is, really an issue of importance, because people should be able to retire at a time that suits them best, but also one that perhaps benefits the employer as well.
Yeah,
Jonathan, is that you?
Yeah, I mean, the way these things are funded, I think, is a little bit smoke and mirrors sometimes anyway, because even though notionally it might be funded through the trustee, actually often it is the employer that's paying for it. So now, if the question is around, well, would that money be better spent on something else, then clearly that's a debate which could be had. But I think the key issue that's trying to be addressed here is that effectively after a lifetime worth of saving, what is the appropriate thing to do in terms of helping members to understand their options at retirement, and whether, of course, there's no such thing as retirement date anymore. So when an individual decides to retire is ultimately down to them. Now, if an employer decides that they don't want older people working for them, then they have to come up with something a bit more than just age to deal with that. It needs to be performance or whatever. So again, we just need to be very, very careful here. Is actually if the suggestion is they want workers to leave earlier, then actually making sure people understand their options and making sure people or allowing people to understand that they can afford to retire or not might be a way to achieve that. But I think we just need to be very, very careful as to what the suggestion is here.
Okay, so my take on that is, firstly, as a trustee, I have to be able to look the FD of a business in the eye and say, I will be a good custodian of your budget, because it's their money. We don't have money to spend on this. It's the trust. The trustees don't have the money. It is the employer's money. That's the key thing. So we have to have that relationship with the employer to understand, what our budgets are and what we can spend them on. Now, clearly, there can be significant cost here. So those conversations have to be had. If you're not going to pay for it, if the trustee stroke employer isn't going to pay for it, then the only option is for the member to seek advice and pay for it themselves, albeit they can pay for some of that, maybe all of it from their fund. But often the reality is members don't seek that advice. The cost is seen as prohibitive. So from a trustee perspective, what I'd be looking to do is have that conversation with the employer, understand their position, and I'll have to work with the budgets that I'm given. Ultimately, and I think this is the direction of travel here, we've got the big push that's coming onto DC consolidation. And I suspect there will come a point when you start to have the conversation, right, okay, so if the budget's going to be if that's what the budget is, are we actually in a position to continue to run this DC scheme, or should we be looking to consolidate? That's an important conversation that needs to be had, because if you get to a point where, as a trustee, you're thinking, we can't really do the things that we need to do to get good outcomes for the members, then you're going to have to, express that in your value for money statement. And then you're going to have to answer questions about, well, what are you doing to improve that? What are your options? What's the plan? And these are all, very valid questions. So I suspect that if the momentum that seems to be there behind behind consolidation of the DC plans, carries on in the current direction of travel, that a lot of smaller DC schemes will be asking the question, are we in the right place, or should we be looking to consolidate?
Jonathan, while we're on budgets, we've got another good question here that asks, is it better to be focusing the scheme's budget on getting members to contribute more, or, to at least not stop contributions, rather than things like TCFD reports or other expensive things, which a majority of the members are not as interested in, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fair point, isn't it? It is a very fair point. The thing is, we don't have a choice, do we? If you're a master trust or one of the very large schemes at the moment, you have to do TCFD. And yes, it's expensive. You have to do your implementation statement. it's a legislative requirement. So look, we could argue long and hard that that money would be better spent in actually getting real money into the pension scheme to provide real benefits for people. I absolutely sympathise with that, but ultimately we are in the environment we're in. These are the requirements that we have to fulfil. We have to do them. In the ideal world, you can afford to do both. Not always easy.
Overall style of communication is also one other thing that I really wanted to touch on this afternoon. Jonathan W., where do you think the importance is in terms of providing positive communications to members, having positive engagement rather than negative things that sort of say, you don't have much longer before you'll absolutely run out of money and that sort of thing? How important is it that we're taking a more positive approach to engagement, or do you think it needs to be a balance of the two?
I guess maybe it does need to be a balance, but I think the perhaps the more important thing is just getting people to think about what they wanted in retirement, and this is true in terms of the accumulation phase. Now, some people may not have much choice because their income just simply does not allow them to save what ideally they would like to save. But if that's the reality of their situation, then they kind of need to know that hard truth. So that might not be a very positive story in their eyes, but it may be the reality of the situation. The same comes to when you get to the point of retirement. A lot of the work that we do is around working through for people whether they can afford to retire. But of course, the affordability in retirement is a very personal thing. You could have two people that have exactly the same size of pension, but because one has aspirations in terms of what they want to do in retirement far beyond the other, then for that individual, they can't afford to retire, whereas perhaps the other individual can. So I think again, a lot of this is about people being clear not only what their options are generically, but also understanding how that applies to them in terms of what they want to do. And of course now it goes into retirement as well. So when people are in retirement for 25 years or whatever it might be, again, and this goes back to a question that was asked earlier around product development. Now, I actually see it more as service development than product development. I think we've got too hung up on products. But how do you provide a service that ensures that an individual gets the income that they need as they go through retirement? Because one of the unfortunate things in terms of, I guess, the backstory of pensions in the UK is up until freedom of choice, of course, most people had to buy an annuity, and an annuity by definition was basically linear. But of course, what we know, the reality of the situation is 25 years in retirement. One thing you can be sure about is your income requirement will not be linear. So on the basis that people aren't buying annuities anymore, well, about 10% are, I think. What are the other 90% doing? And so then that goes back to that service proposition about how people use money, spend money. What is the investment performance on that money as they go through that 25 years? They may decide they're going to take £15,000 out of their pension next year to live on. But if all of a sudden the car blows up and they need to get a new car, then they've got a stark choice. They're either going to be taking more out of their pension, or they're not going to be having a car. Now, it's not for us to say which is the right or wrong decision, but actually that service proposition needs to allow for those change in needs, because it certainly is not linear. The other point I will add to this, actually, which I think is quite interesting, and there's a lot of research in the US on this, and of course, because of the US has effectively had freedom and choice for many years, so there's a lot more data on this going over a much longer period of time. Is that this basic notion that savers are savers and spenders are spenders. So when you look at the US research, what you see is that when people have additional expenditure in retirement, so the car blows up or whatever it might be, they actually adjust what they will take out in a subsequent year. So they would go, oh right, well, that was an unexpected expense. Actually, over the next year or so, I will adjust what I take out because I want to make sure that I don't run out of money. Equally, if they're going along quite nicely and the returns on their investments are doing slightly better than they anticipated, they might say, oh, you know what, we're going to have that second holiday this year because we believe we can afford it. And it even goes to the extent of, so that's at a very individual level, but it also gets influenced by the macro level as well. So the research shows that if there's a load of positive news coverage around the economy generally, people feel more bullish and they're more likely to pull a bit more money out. Whereas if all the news is bad news, then they're likely to perhaps limit how much they take out. So there is a sort of self-regulation that goes, what the research would suggest, which again is why we shouldn't overplay this. People are going to run out of money. The people that are most likely to run out of money are the people that actually never had much money in the first place because they were actually the spenders. They were never the savers.
An interesting point there. Just on that note, we are edging closer to 4 p.m. So to wrap things up, I wanted to ask you both for your key takeaways from this discussion. Jonathan R., starting with you.
So one thing that we haven't really touched on is the whole climate change and ESG agenda. And I think this represents a real communication opportunity for members. We've already had one of the questions on TCFD. Anybody who's close to pensions knows how much work is going in on these issues. And it's a good news story. And we need to be communicating it with our members, and we need to be connecting them with their assets. We need them to see themselves as investors. And I think this would actually make an enormous change, particularly for the younger people, if they saw, I'm an investor. Each month my money is going into these things. And if they can see that that's doing good, if that's helping the climate transition, if there's positive news stories come from it, I think that is a hugely important engagement tool, particularly for that generation who is highly likely to be completely reliant on their DC fund. They have to be investors for life, really. And if we can connect them with their investments and get them to understand that, I think it's a real positive step for overall engagement with their pensions.
Yeah, fantastic. And takeaway comments for you, Jonathan W?
Yeah, so I think the key thing is have a program. Now, what that program looks like, I think, will depend on a lot of things. It will depend certainly on the profile of your membership, both in terms of age and learning, how much they're able to save, so earnings level. But I think have a program that's segmented. Remember those two areas I mentioned earlier, which is, it's about the marketing, it's about how you engage. So you need to do that on a segmented basis, and it's about learning styles. So how will you actually provide that information and that learning to those various segmented groups. And always think about it really as a funnel is probably the best way to picture it. So educate people around what they need to know, and as I say, that will be a different message for different people at different times. But educate them around what that message is at the appropriate time. Allow them to have support mechanisms, and that support mechanisms could be tools, it could be a helpline, and also make sure that for those people, particularly coming up to retirement, if they do want access to regulated advice, so what you will find is that if you put a program in place, more people will ask for regulated advice because all of a sudden they put more value on it because they realize the risk of getting it wrong and what it may cost them. Then if you are going to put some sort of regulated advice in place, make sure you do very, very thorough due diligence on any provider you bring in. We all know the horror stories, but of course not all firms are like that. So I would urge people to do very, very strict DD.
Fantastic. Well, look, that is an excellent note for us to conclude on this afternoon. Thank you to our two speakers today, Jonathan Watsley of Wealth at Work and Jonathan Reynolds from Capital Cranfield. Thank you also to you tuning in at home or from your office, and those of you that asked so many great questions. So thanks very much again, and goodbye.